I had never been late to work in 10 years. But that morning, as I opened my garage door, my heart stopped, because a bright red SUV was parked across my driveway, trapping me inside. And standing next to it, arms crossed, was the one person I dreaded more than anyone in the neighborhood, our HOA's self-proclaimed queen, Karen. The morning had started like any other. The coffee maker gurgled to life at 6:15 a.m., filling my kitchen with the familiar aroma of dark roast. I'd checked my phone, scrolled through emails, and grabbed my travel mug with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd perfected his routine. Over a decade of early mornings. The garage door opener hummed as I pressed the button, and I expected to see the empty street stretching before me, bathed in the golden light of dawn. Instead, I saw red. Literally. A massive Cadillac Escalade, painted the color of fresh blood, sat perpendicular across my driveway entrance. Not parked slightly askew, not accidentally blocking part of the path, deliberately, methodically positioned to ensure I couldn't move an inch forward or backward. My coffee mug slipped from my fingers, shattering against the concrete floor of my garage. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the morning stillness. "Problem, David?" Karen's voice cut through the air like a rusty blade. She emerged from behind her SUV with the slow, deliberate movements of someone savoring every second of their victory. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it stretched the skin around her eyes, and her fluorescent pink tracksuit made her look like a highlighter that had gained sentience and developed a grudge against humanity. I stepped out of my garage, glass crunching under my work boots. "Karen, what are you doing? I need to get to work." She tilted her head with mock confusion, the same expression she'd worn when she'd fined Mrs. Henderson for having dandelions in her yard. "Oh, I'm so sorry. Did I block something important?" My hands clenched into fists at my sides. The woman knew exactly what she was doing. The Escalade's position wasn't an accident or a moment of thoughtless parking. The vehicle sat perfectly, centered across my driveway's mouth, positioned with the precision of someone who had planned this moment down to the last detail. "This is harassment, Karen. Move your car. Now." She examined her nails, painted the same aggressive pink as her outfit, with theatrical indifference. "I'm parked on a public street, David. Last I checked, I had every right to park wherever I choose, as long as it's legal." Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "You wouldn't want me to report you for making threats, would you? The HOA takes neighbor disputes very seriously." The blood pounded in my ears. I pulled out my phone to call work, knowing I'd have to explain why I was going to be late for the first time since I'd started at Morrison Construction. My supervisor wouldn't care about HOA politics or neighborhood feuds. He'd only care that his most reliable foreman was suddenly unreliable. "Janet?" "Yeah, it's David. I'm going to be about 30 minutes late this morning. There's a situation at home." I caught Karen smirking as she listened to my conversation. "No, nothing serious. Just need to handle something with a neighbor." As I hung up, Karen stepped closer, her presence invading my personal space with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. The morning sun caught the gleam in her eyes, not warmth, but something colder. Satisfaction, maybe. Or hunger. "You know, David, this could all be so much simpler if you just followed the rules like everyone else." Her voice dropped to a whisper, but every word carried the weight of a threat. "Your trash bins were out 17 minutes past collection. Time last Tuesday. Your garden hose has been visible from the street for 3 weeks. And don't get me started on that oil stain in your driveway." I stared at her, speechless. She had been watching. Timing. Documenting. Every aspect of my life had been under surveillance by this woman who had somehow convinced herself that she was the neighborhood's savior rather than its tormentor. I work 60-hour weeks to pay for this house, Karen. I'm not interested in your games. Games? She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Oh, David, this isn't a game. This is about maintaining property values. This is about standards. This is about making sure people like you understand that actions have consequences. The way she said, "people like you," made my skin crawl. I wasn't sure what category she'd placed me in, but it was clearly somewhere beneath her consideration as a human being. A curtain twitched in Mrs. Patterson's window across the street. Old Mr. Rodriguez slowed his morning walk, pretending to examine his phone while obviously listening to our conversation. The whole neighborhood was watching, and everyone knew better than to intervene. Karen had trained them well through months of systematic intimidation. "I'll ask you one more time," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "Move your car." Karen stepped back and folded her arms across her chest, her posture radiating defiance. "Make me." For a moment, I considered it. The fantasy played out in my mind with vivid clarity. Calling a tow truck, having her precious SUV dragged away while she screamed and threatened, but I knew Karen too well. She'd have documentation proving she was legally parked. She'd have witnesses lined up to testify about my aggressive behavior. She'd turn me into the villain of whatever story she'd already written in her head. Instead, I took a step back and really looked at her, at the way she stood with her feet planted wide, claiming territory, at the smile playing around the corners of her mouth, at the way her eyes never stopped calculating, measuring, planning her next move. That's when I realized something that should have terrified me, but instead filled me with a strange calm. This wasn't random harassment. This wasn't about trash, bins or oil stains or any of the petty violations she'd been documenting. This was personal. Karen had decided to destroy me, and she wouldn't stop until she'd driven me from the neighborhood entirely. But what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that I had spent 10 years in construction. Management dealing with people who thought they could intimidate, threaten, and manipulate their way to victory. I had learned patience. I had learned planning. And I had learned that the person who strikes first isn't always the person who wins. As I stood there in my garage, surrounded by the smell of spilled coffee and shattered ceramic, watching Karen savor her moment of triumph, I made a decision that would change everything. I smiled. "You know what, Karen? You're absolutely right. You can park wherever you want." I turned and walked back toward my house, my footsteps echoing in the garage. "Thanks for the reminder about following the rules. I'll definitely keep that in mind." I heard her laugh behind me, the sound trailing after me like smoke. She thought she had won. She thought she had broken me. But as I closed the garage door behind me and walked back into my kitchen to clean up the broken mug, I wasn't thinking about being late to work or explaining the situation to my supervisor. I wasn't thinking about the neighbors who had watched our confrontation from behind their curtains. I was thinking about rules, about documentation, about consequences, and I was thinking about how Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Karen didn't just live in our neighborhood. She ruled it like a dictator with a clipboard. Maple Heights had been a quiet suburb when I'd moved here 5 years ago. Tree-lined streets, modest two-story homes with small but well-maintained yards, and the kind of neighborhood where people waved at each other from their driveways, and kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. It was exactly what I'd dreamed of after years of apartment living. A place to put down roots, build equity, maybe even start a family someday. The HOA had seemed reasonable at first. Standard stuff. keep your grass cut. Don't paint your house. Neon green. Pick up after your dog. The monthly fees weren't unreasonable, and the neighborhood amenities, a small playground, well-maintained common areas, regular snow removal, justified the cost. I'd signed the papers without reading every line of fine print, figuring that as long as I kept my property neat and minded my own business, I'd never have any problems. That was before Karen Phillips moved in. She arrived on a Tuesday in March, her moving truck blocking traffic for 6 hours, while she directed the movers with the precision of a general commanding troops. Within a week, she had introduced herself to every household on the block, armed with a laminated folder containing HOA bylaws, neighborhood suggestions, and a business card identifying her as a community standards consultant, whatever that meant. Within a month, she had gotten herself elected to the HOA board. Within 3 months, she had effectively taken control of it. Karen's method was simple but devastatingly effective. She attended every HOA meeting with a stack of prepared reports documenting violations she claimed to have observed throughout the neighborhood. Garbage bins left out past pickup time, dogs off-leash in common areas, children's toys visible from the street, garden decorations that didn't meet aesthetic standards. She presented her findings with the thoroughness of a prosecutor and the moral authority of someone who genuinely believed she was saving the neighborhood from chaos. At first, the other board members pushed back. Tom Brennan, who'd been HOA president for 6 years, tried to remind everyone that they were neighbors, not wardens. "We're here to maintain property values and handle basic upkeep," he'd said during one particularly heated meeting I'd attended. "We're not the code enforcement police." But Karen was relentless. She'd arrive at meetings with photographs, timestamps, and legal citations. She'd quote property law and reference case studies from other neighborhoods where lax enforcement had led to declining home values. She spoke with such authority and conviction that other board members began to question their own judgment. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it was thorough. Tom Brennan resigned after Karen publicly questioned his commitment to community standards at a packed meeting. Sarah Chen, the vice president, moved to another neighborhood rather than continue fighting what she privately called Karen's holy war. One by one, Karen replaced them with people who shared her vision of perfect suburban order. The first fine I received was for leaving my trash bins at the curb until Wednesday evening after a Tuesday pickup. According to the citation, bins were required to be removed from street view by 6 p.m. on collection day. The fine was $25, and the letter was signed by Karen in her new capacity as compliance officer, a position she'd created for herself. I paid it without argument, figuring it was easier than fighting over something so petty. That was my first mistake. The second fine came 2 weeks later. Unauthorized vehicle display. My work truck, which I parked in my own driveway every night, apparently violated a clause about commercial vehicles in residential areas. $50, with a warning that repeated violations would result in escalating penalties. I attended the next HOA meeting to contest the fine, armed with documentation showing that my truck was classified as a personal vehicle and that I was a homeowner, not a business operating out of my residence. Karen listened to my presentation with the patient expression of a teacher humoring a slow student. "Mr. Martinez," she said when I finished, "I understand your confusion, but the bylaws are very clear about maintaining residential character. Your truck, while technically legal, sends the wrong message about our community standards. We're not a trailer park or a construction camp. We're a family neighborhood that takes pride in appearance." The other board members, all Karen appointees, by this point nodded solemnly. My fine was upheld, and I was advised to find more appropriate parking arrangements for my vehicle. That night, I sat in my kitchen reading through the HOA bylaws with the kind of attention I should have paid before buying the house. What I found was chilling. Karen hadn't just taken control of the board, she had rewritten the rules entirely. The original HOA agreement was still technically in effect, but it had been buried under dozens of amendments, clarifications, and emergency provisions that gave the board broad discretionary power to define and enforce community standards. Under Karen's interpretation, homeowners could be fined for everything from having the wrong type of doormat to displaying garden decorations that weren't seasonally appropriate. The penalties escalated rapidly. First offense was $25, second was $50, third was $100, and continued violations could result in liens against the property. But the most insidious part wasn't the fines themselves. It was how Karen wielded them. She didn't target everyone equally. Families who attended meetings and publicly supported her decisions somehow never seemed to violate any regulations. People who questioned her authority found themselves under constant scrutiny. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who lived 2 houses down from me, had been fined repeatedly for having dandelions in her yard. When she explained that she couldn't afford professional landscaping on her fixed income and asked for help understanding which plants were considered weeds, Karen suggested she reconsider whether home ownership was still appropriate for her situation. The Morrison family received citations for allowing their 6-year-old to draw with chalk on their own driveway. Temporary markings on concrete surfaces were apparently prohibited under the community aesthetic standards that Karen had implemented. Veterans in the neighborhood were told their flag displays violated uniformity guidelines. Young families were fined for having children's bicycles visible from the street. Dog owners received warnings about excessive barking, even when their pets were inside their homes. But Karen's true genius lay in her ability to make everyone feel isolated. She handled violations privately, through official letters and one-on-one confrontations. Neighbors didn't realize that others were facing the same harassment. Everyone thought they were the only one having problems, the only one being unreasonable, the only one who couldn't manage to meet the community's simple standards. I learned this the hard way after my 3rd fine, $100 for improper refuse container positioning. I'd put my garbage bins out the night before pickup instead of the morning, apparently violating a new rule that Karen had implemented to reduce overnight visual pollution. When I complained to my next-door neighbor, Janet, she just shrugged. You know how Karen is about the rules. I just try to stay on her good side. Don't you think this is getting ridiculous? I pressed. $100 because I put my trash out 12 hours early? Janet glanced around nervously, as if Karen might be listening from the bushes. Look, David, I don't want any trouble. Maybe if you just tried harder to follow the guidelines? That conversation was a revelation. Karen hadn't just taken control of the HOA, she had created a culture of fear where neighbors turned away from each other rather than risk becoming targets themselves. She had convinced an entire community that her increasingly draconian enforcement was normal, necessary, and ultimately for everyone's benefit. Standing in my kitchen that evening, reading through Karen's latest newsletter about maintaining excellence in community standards, I realized I was facing something more dangerous than simple harassment. This wasn't about following rules or maintaining property values. This was about power, control, and one person's determination to reshape an entire neighborhood according to her personal vision of perfection. But what chilled me most wasn't Karen's obvious megalomania. It was how effectively she had isolated and demoralized her neighbors. She had convinced people that resistance was futile, that compliance was easier than conflict, and that anyone who stood up to her was selfish, unreasonable, or simply didn't care about the community. As I folded the newsletter and tossed it in the trash, I made a decision that would change everything. Karen might have convinced everyone else that she was untouchable, but I had spent enough time in construction to know that every structure has weak points. Every foundation can be undermined. Every tyrant eventually makes mistakes. Karen had chosen the wrong neighbor to break, and she was about to learn exactly how expensive that mistake would be. Blocking my driveway was only the beginning. Karen wasn't finished with me. She wanted to break me. The pattern became clear over the following weeks. Every few days, a new citation would appear in my mailbox, each one more absurd than the last. Excessive vehicle idling in driveway. When I let my truck warm up for 3 minutes on a cold morning. Unauthorized landscape modification when I pulled a few weeds from around my front steps. Noise violation for using my lawnmower at 7 p.m. on a Saturday. Apparently, lawn maintenance was restricted to specific hours that Karen had designated as community-friendly. Each fine was carefully documented with photographs, timestamps, and legal justifications that read like they'd been copied from municipal code enforcement manuals. Karen wasn't just making up rules, she was researching actual ordinances and adapting them to fit her personal vision of neighborhood management. But the fines were just the beginning. It started with the phone calls. My home phone would ring at exactly 8:30 p.m., just late enough to be annoying, but not late enough to clearly violate noise ordinances. Karen's voice would greet me with saccharine politeness. "Good evening, David. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I noticed your garden hose was visible from the street again today. I just wanted to give you a friendly reminder about our community standards before I have to file another citation." The calls came every few days, always with a different minor violation to discuss. My doormat was the wrong color. My mailbox numbers weren't properly aligned. My recycling bin had been positioned 3 inches too far to the left. Each conversation followed the same script. Feigned concern, detailed documentation of my failures, and thinly veiled threats about escalating consequences. "I really hate having to do this," she'd say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But you understand that rules exist for everyone's benefit. I can't show favoritism just because we're neighbors." After 2 weeks of nightly calls, I started letting them go to voicemail. Karen adapted by leaving increasingly detailed messages about violations I hadn't even committed yet. "David, I noticed you've been getting home from work around 6:15 this week. I just wanted to remind you that parking commercial vehicles in residential driveways overnight requires advance notification to the board. I'd hate for you to accidentally violate that policy." The psychological toll was exhausting. Every time I came home from work, I found myself scanning my property for potential violations. Was my trash bin positioned correctly? Had I left any tools visible? Were my garden borders perfectly straight? I started taking pictures of my own property each morning before leaving for work, creating documentation to defend myself against accusations I knew were coming. But Karen's surveillance went deeper than I initially realized. One evening, while taking out my trash, I noticed her standing in her front yard with what looked like a professional camera, complete with a telephoto lens. She wasn't even attempting to be subtle about it. When she saw me looking, she raised the camera and took several photos, the flash illuminating her face in the growing dusk. "Just documenting some potential violations," she called out cheerfully. "Hope you don't mind. Public areas are fair game for photography." The next morning, I found a citation for improper refuse handling attached to my mailbox. According to Karen's documentation, I had dragged my garbage bin across my driveway instead of lifting it, creating unseemly scraping noises that disturbed the evening tranquility of the neighborhood. The fine was $75 with a note that repeated Offenses would result in escalated enforcement measures. But the photographs revealed something more disturbing than Karen's obsessive documentation. She had been taking pictures of my property from multiple angles, at different times of day, with the systematic thoroughness of a surveillance operation. The images attached to my citation showed my house from the street, my driveway from 3 different angles, and even shots taken from what must have been her second-story window looking down into my backyard. I wasn't just being harassed, I was being stalked. The realization hit me one Saturday morning when I was washing my truck in the driveway. Karen appeared at the property line between our yards, notepad in hand, openly taking notes about my activities. She wasn't even pretending to be doing yard work or checking her mail. She was simply standing there, watching me, writing down everything I did. "Beautiful day for outdoor maintenance," she said, when I looked up from rinsing my truck's bumper. "Yeah, it is." I kept my voice neutral, but my skin was crawling. "Getting some cleaning done yourself?" She tapped her pen against her notepad and smiled. "Oh, I'm always working on community improvement projects. Speaking of which, I hope you're planning to clean up that water runoff before it creates environmental fee concerns." I looked down at the small puddle of soapy water collecting at the end of my driveway. "It's biodegradable car soap, Karen. It'll evaporate." "I'm sure it will," she said, making another note. "But standing water can attract mosquitoes, create slip hazards, and generally detract from curb appeal. I'd hate for something preventable to become a larger issue." As she walked away, still scribbling in her notepad, I realized that Karen wasn't just documenting violations, she was creating them. Every interaction was an opportunity for her to identify new ways to find me, new interpretations of existing rules, new reasons to assert her authority over my daily life. But the real breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in early June. I had been working late on a renovation project, trying to finish a kitchen installation before the client's family returned from vacation. It was nearly 9 p.m. when I finally got home, exhausted and covered in drywall dust. All I wanted was a shower, some dinner, and maybe an hour of mindless television before bed. Instead, I found Karen standing on my front porch, arms folded, with what looked like an official document in her hands. "David, I'm glad I caught you. We need to talk." "It's been a long day, Karen. Can this wait until tomorrow?" She held up the document, which I could now see was some kind of legal form. "I'm afraid not. This is a formal complaint I'm filing with the county about ongoing violations of health and safety codes on your property. I wanted to give you the courtesy of discussing it before I submit it in the morning." My exhaustion evaporated, replaced by cold fury. "Health and safety violations? What are you talking about?" Karen pulled out her ever-present folder and began reading from a typed list. "Improper storage of construction materials in residential areas. Use of power tools during restricted hours. Tracking of hazardous construction debris onto public sidewalks. Parking of unlicensed commercial vehicles in violation of zoning ordinances." Every accusation was technically based on something real. I did keep some tools and supplies in my garage. I had used a circular saw in my backyard on a Sunday afternoon. My boots had probably tracked some sawdust onto the sidewalk, and my truck's registration did list it as a commercial vehicle. But Karen had twisted each mundane reality into a legal violation that sounded serious enough to warrant county investigation. "This is harassment," I said, my voice carefully controlled, despite the rage building in my chest. "You're making up problems that don't exist. I'm protecting property values and ensuring compliance with community standards," she replied, with the mechanical precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "If you were simply following the rules like everyone else, we wouldn't be having this discussion." "Everyone else?" Karen, You've been targeting me specifically for months. When's the last time you fined anyone else in the neighborhood?" Her smile was sharp and satisfied. "I fine people when they violate regulations. The fact that you seem to be struggling with compliance more than your neighbors says more about your choices than my enforcement policies." Standing on my own porch, looking at this woman who had systematically made my life miserable for months, I realized that Karen had escalated beyond petty harassment. She was trying to involve government agencies, create legal problems that could affect my job, and potentially force me to sell my house and leave the neighborhood entirely. But as I looked at her smug expression, her carefully prepared documentation, her obvious enjoyment of my frustration, I also realized something else. Karen had gotten comfortable. She had convinced herself that I was helpless, that her position was unassailable, that she could push as hard as she wanted without consequences. She was about to discover how wrong she was. "You know what, Karen? You're absolutely right. I haven't been paying enough attention to community standards." I took the complaint form from her hands and glanced through it, noting every fabricated violation, every twisted interpretation, every obvious attempt to weaponize regulations against me. "Thanks for bringing this to my attention. I'll definitely be more careful about following the rules." For just a moment, her triumphant expression flickered with uncertainty. "Well, good. I'm glad we understand each other." "Oh, we understand each other perfectly." I folded the document and tucked it into my shirt pocket. "Have a good evening, Karen. And thanks again for the reminder about documentation. I'll definitely keep that in mind going forward." As she walked back to her house, I stood on my porch and watched her go. Karen thought she had won. She thought she had finally found the pressure point that would break me. She thought that by threatening my livelihood and my home, she had demonstrated her ultimate power over my life. But standing there in the evening darkness, holding her fabricated complaint in my hands, I wasn't thinking about county investigations, or legal problems, or community standards. I was thinking about warfare, about strategy, about the difference between winning battles and winning wars. Karen had just declared total war, and she had no idea what she had unleashed. What Karen didn't know was that I had something she couldn't control: leverage. The morning after Karen's threat to involve county officials, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and began planning my counterattack. For months, I had been reacting to her harassment, playing defense, trying to comply with her ever-changing interpretations of neighborhood rules. But Karen's escalation had crossed a line that changed everything. She wanted to play hardball? Fine. But she had picked the wrong opponent. My first advantage was something Karen couldn't have anticipated. I knew how to read legal documents. 10 years in construction management meant dealing with contracts, building codes, zoning regulations, and municipal ordinances on a daily basis. When property owners tried to change project specifications after signing agreements, when subcontractors claimed they weren't responsible for code violations, when city inspectors found problems that threatened project timelines, I had learned to dig into the fine print and find solutions. Karen's mistake was assuming that because I worked with my hands, I didn't work with my brain. I started by requesting a complete copy of the HOA's current bylaws and all amendments from the property management company that handled our neighborhood's administrative functions. What I received was a 47-page document that had been modified so many times it resembled legal spaghetti. But buried in that maze of amendments, clarifications, and emergency provisions were some very interesting contradictions. Karen had been creative in expanding the HOA's enforcement powers, but she had also been sloppy. In her eagerness to create new ways to fine residents, She had created rules that conflicted with existing regulations, exceeded the HOA's legal authority, and in some cases violated state laws about homeowner rights. For example, her commercial vehicle restrictions were more stringent than the city's actual zoning ordinances. Her noise violation policies attempted to regulate activities that were explicitly protected under municipal codes, and her aesthetic standards gave the HOA board discretionary power to make subjective judgments that courts had consistently ruled were unenforceable. But more importantly, Karen had created rules that she herself was violating. This discovery came during my second research session, when I decided to apply Karen's enforcement standards to Karen's own property. If she was going to document my every action with photographic evidence and timestamp precision, I could do the same thing. I started small, just paying attention during my daily routines. Walking to my mailbox, I noticed that Karen's garbage bins were often positioned incorrectly according to her own regulations. Leaving for work, I observed that her landscaping included several plant varieties that didn't appear on the approved species list she had distributed to other neighbors. Coming home in the evening, I saw that her outdoor lighting was brighter than the community standards she had established. But the real revelation came when I decided to research her car. Karen drove that blood-red Cadillac Escalade like it was a symbol of her authority, parking it prominently in her driveway where everyone could see its pristine condition and obvious expense. But when I ran the license plate number through the state's online vehicle registration system, a service available to anyone willing to pay a small fee, I discovered something fascinating. The Escalade was registered as a commercial vehicle. Not only was it classified as commercial, but according to the registration records, it was listed under Phillips Property Management Services, apparently a business entity that Karen operated. The same Karen who had been fining me for parking my work truck in my own driveway because commercial vehicles disrupted residential character. But it got better. When I cross-referenced the business license database, I found that Phillips Property Management Services was registered as a home-based business operating out of Karen's residential address, the same address where she lived in a neighborhood with HOA regulations that explicitly prohibited operating businesses out of residential properties, regulations that she had personally strengthened during her tenure on the board. And when I checked the vehicle inspection records, I discovered that the Escalade hadn't passed its annual state inspection in over 8 months. Karen had been driving an illegally uninsured, uninspected commercial vehicle, while simultaneously fining neighbors for violations that were far more minor than her own. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but it was also legally actionable. Armed with this information, I began expanding my research. If Karen was violating her own rules, what other secrets might careful investigation reveal? I started documenting everything with the same obsessive thoroughness that Karen had brought to Taituanswider, harassing me. I photographed her property at different times of day, noting violations of the aesthetic standards she enforced against others. I recorded timestamps of her activities, documenting noise violations when she ran her leaf blower early in the morning or late in the evening. I researched the legal status of every modification she had made to her property, from her unauthorized outdoor lighting to her unpermitted deck extension. But most importantly, I began building a case file that demonstrated a pattern of selective enforcement, personal harassment, and abuse of HOA authority. The breakthrough came when I realized that Karen's harassment campaign wasn't limited to me. She was targeting other residents as well, but she was doing it strategically, isolating her victims and preventing them from comparing experiences or organizing resistance. I started paying closer attention to my neighbors' daily routines, looking for signs of the same treatment I had been receiving. What I found was both disturbing and encouraging. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow Karen had been targeting with landscaping fines, was clearly struggling to meet the physical and financial demands of Karen's enforcement. But she was also keeping meticulous records of every citation, every phone call, and every interaction. Not because she planned to fight back, but because she was terrified of missing some requirement and facing even harsher penalties. The Morrison family had stopped letting their children play in their own front yard after receiving multiple citations for excessive noise and unsightly toy display. But they had also started documenting the times when other neighborhood children played outside, without receiving similar violations, creating an inadvertent record of Karen's discriminatory enforcement patterns. Even my next-door neighbor Janet, who had advised me to stay on Karen's good side, was quietly dealing with her own harassment. She had received warnings about her garden decorations, her parking habits, and her dog's behavior, but she was handling it all in isolation, convinced that compliance was easier than conflict. The pattern was clear. Karen was systematically targeting residents who she perceived as threats to her authority, using HOA regulations as weapons to enforce her personal vision of neighborhood control. But she was also creating a paper trail that documented her abuse of power with remarkable precision. All I had to do was connect the dots. Over the following weeks, I quietly reached out to other residents who seemed to be struggling with HOA enforcement. I didn't present myself as a leader or organizer, just a neighbor who was curious about their experiences with community standards. What I heard was a consistent story of harassment, intimidation, and selective enforcement that painted Karen as exactly what she was: a neighborhood tyrant who had weaponized bureaucracy to control her neighbors' lives. But I also heard something else, a quiet, growing resentment that was looking for an outlet. People were tired of walking on eggshells in their own neighborhood. They were frustrated with paying HOA fees to fund harassment campaigns against their neighbors. They were angry about being treated like subjects instead of homeowners who had invested their life savings in properties that were supposed to represent security and freedom. They just needed someone to show them that Karen wasn't as powerful as she pretended to be. Sitting in my kitchen one evening, reviewing the evidence I had gathered over 6 weeks of careful research, I realized that Karen had made a fatal strategic error. In her eagerness to destroy me, she had revealed the full extent of her own vulnerabilities. Her harassment campaign had been so systematic, so well documented, and so obviously personal that it created a legal liability that could bring down her entire reign of terror. But more than that, her treatment of multiple neighbors had created the foundation for organized resistance. People who had been suffering in isolation were ready to stand together if they knew they weren't alone. Karen thought she held all the cards. She thought her position on the HOA board made her untouchable. She thought her detailed documentation and legal justifications made her enforcement unassailable. She was about to learn that the same tools she had used to oppress her neighbors could be turned against her. And when that happened, her reign as the neighborhood's self-appointed dictator would end not with a bang, but with the quiet satisfaction of justice finally served. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. The whole neighborhood was quietly waiting for someone to fight back. The revelation came on a Thursday evening in late June. I had been observing Karen's surveillance routine for weeks, documenting the times she positioned herself in her yard to photograph neighbors and noting which residents seemed to be under the most scrutiny. But that evening, as I watched her emerge with her camera to document some perceived violation, I noticed something I had missed before. Other people were watching too. Mrs. Patterson across the street was at her living room window, partially hidden behind her curtains, but clearly observing Karen's activities. Mr. Rodriguez had paused his evening walk and was pretending to check his phone while obviously listening to Karen's confrontation with the teenage son of the Chen family about skateboard noise. Even the Hendersons' next-door neighbor, Mr. Walsh, was standing in his garage with the door open, ostensibly organizing tools, but actually watching the scene unfold. The neighborhood wasn't just enduring Karen's tyranny. They were quietly documenting it. This realization changed everything. For months, I had assumed I was fighting alone, that other residents either supported Karen or were too intimidated to resist. But what I was seeing suggested something different. A community that had been systematically silenced, but not actually defeated. I decided to test this theory carefully. The next Saturday morning, while working in my front garden, I made sure to position myself where Mrs. Patterson could see me from her window. When Karen inevitably appeared to document whatever violation she could manufacture from my gardening activities, I caught Mrs. Patterson's eye and gave a small, knowing shake of my head, the universal gesture of shared frustration. Mrs. Patterson's response was immediate and unmistakable. She stepped closer to her window and gave me a subtle thumbs-down gesture, followed by an exaggerated eye roll that made her opinion of Karen perfectly clear. It was a small moment, but it confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The neighborhood's apparent compliance with Karen's regime was really a facade of strategic silence. People weren't supporting her, they were surviving her. Over the following week, I began testing this theory with other neighbors. A sympathetic grimace when passing Mr. Rodriguez during his evening walk. A knowing look exchanged with Janet when we both received our mail at the same time that Karen was photographing someone else's property. A quiet comment to Mr. Walsh about how some people take community standards pretty seriously, while Karen was within earshot, but not close enough to overhear. Each interaction revealed the same thing. Beneath the surface, compliance was a shared resentment that had been building for months. People were tired of living in fear of their own neighborhood association. They were frustrated with being treated like criminals for normal homeowner activities. They were angry about paying fees to fund harassment campaigns against their neighbors. They just needed permission to speak up. The breakthrough came during the neighborhood's annual 4th of July block party, an event that Karen had somehow managed to turn into another opportunity for enforcement and control. In previous years, according to longtime residents, the block party had been a casual affair. Neighbors would set up grills in their driveways, kids would run between houses playing games, and families would gather in small groups to eat, drink, and enjoy each other's company. It was exactly the kind of community-building event that HOAs were supposed to facilitate. Under Karen's management, the block party had become a regulated ordeal. 2 weeks before the event, every household received a detailed packet outlining the community standards for the celebration. Grills could only be positioned in designated areas. Music was restricted to family-friendly selections, played at conversation-appropriate volumes. Children's activities were limited to structured, supervised games in approved locations. Alcohol consumption was prohibited in public view, meaning people couldn't drink beer in their own front yards. But the most absurd regulation was the aesthetic coordination requirement. Karen had decreed that decorations needed to be harmonious with community standards, which apparently meant that red, white, and blue decorations were acceptable only if they met specific color saturation and display guidelines that she had created. I received my block party packet on the same day that Karen left another citation on my mailbox for excessive mulch displacement in my garden beds. As I read through her list of patriotic regulations, I realized that she had finally gone too far. Even the most compliant neighbors would struggle to find the 4th of July threatening to property values. More importantly, I realized that the block party provided the perfect opportunity to gauge community sentiment without directly challenging Karen's authority. I spent the morning of July 4th setting up my own modest celebration. A small grill in my driveway, a folding table with some snacks, and a couple of chairs positioned where I could observe the neighborhood's festivities. I made sure to follow Karen's regulations precisely, partly to avoid giving her ammunition against me, and partly to demonstrate that compliance was possible for someone who actually read her requirements. But I also made sure to be visibly welcoming to anyone who wanted to stop by and chat. The first visitor was Mr. Rodriguez, who accepted my offer of a hamburger and settled into one of my lawn chairs with obvious relief. "Thanks for this," he said, gesturing toward the simple setup. "I was wondering if anyone was actually going to celebrate today, or if we were all just going to sit in our backyards and pretend to have fun." Karen's regulations seemed pretty clear about what's allowed, I said carefully, testing his reaction. Mr. Rodriguez snorted. "Karen's regulations. You know, I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like this. We used to actually enjoy these events." It was the first time I had heard anyone directly criticize Karen's management, and it opened the floodgates. Over the next hour, neighbor after neighbor stopped by my modest celebration. What started as casual conversations about the weather and holiday plans gradually evolved into something much more significant. People finally felt safe enough to share their experiences with Karen's enforcement regime. Mrs. Henderson described the terror she felt every time she checked her mailbox, knowing that another citation could push her toward financial crisis. "I'm 78 years old," she said, her voice shaking with frustration. "I've lived in my house for 23 years, and now I'm afraid to plant flowers because I might choose the wrong variety." The Morrison family shared their children's confusion about why they couldn't play in their own yard. "My 8-year-old asked me if we were going to get in trouble for having a birthday party," Mrs. Morrison said. "What kind of neighborhood makes children afraid to celebrate in their own homes?" Even Janet, my next-door neighbor who had previously advised me to comply with Karen's demands, opened up about the stress of constant surveillance. "I moved here because I wanted a nice, quiet place to live," she said. "I didn't sign up for a military boarding school with a crazy commandant." But the most revealing conversation came from Mr. Walsh, the military veteran who lived next to the Hendersons. He had been one of Karen's targets because of his flag display. Apparently, the size and positioning of his American flag violated some aesthetic guideline that Karen had imposed. "You know what bothers me most?" he said, his voice quiet but intense. "It's not the fines or the harassment. It's that she's convinced everyone they're powerless. People are afraid to speak up because they think she's got all the authority. But HOA boards aren't dictatorships. They serve at the pleasure of the homeowners, not the other way around." That statement crystallized something I had been thinking about for weeks. Karen's power wasn't actually legal or permanent. It was psychological. She had convinced people that resistance was futile, that compliance was the only option, that challenging her authority would only make things worse. But Mr. Walsh was right. HOA boards were elected bodies that could be replaced through democratic processes. Karen's regulations could be challenged, modified, or eliminated if enough homeowners demanded change. Her enforcement patterns could be reviewed, and her authority could be limited if residents organized to demand accountability. The neighborhood wasn't actually powerless. They had just been convinced to act like they were. As the afternoon progressed, and more neighbors shared their stories, I began to see the scope of Karen's impact on the community. She wasn't just harassing individual residents, she was systematically destroying the social fabric that made neighborhood living pleasant and rewarding. Children were afraid to play outside. Elderly residents were stressed about maintaining their properties. Young families were considering moving rather than dealing with constant criticism and fines. Veterans were being told their patriotic displays were inappropriate. Dog owners were afraid to walk their pets. Gardening enthusiasts were giving up their hobbies to avoid violation citations. Karen had taken a community that had functioned peacefully for years and turned it into a place where people felt like prisoners in their own homes. But she had also created something she hadn't anticipated: a shared sense of injustice that was stronger than the individual fear she had tried to instill. By the end of the block party, I had heard similar stories from 15 different households. People who had been suffering in isolation discovered that their experiences were part of a larger pattern of abuse. Neighbors who had been afraid to complain learned that others shared their frustrations and were equally ready for change. Most importantly, I had identified a core group of residents who were willing to take action if someone could show them how to fight back effectively. That evening, as I cleaned up from the day's festivities, I looked across the street at Karen's house. Her own 4th of July celebration had consisted of a single small flag, positioned precisely according to her own regulations, and a community standards sign, reminding neighbors about noise ordinances during holiday gatherings. She had spent the entire day patrolling the neighborhood with her camera and clipboard, documenting violations and preparing citations instead of celebrating with her neighbors. She had chosen enforcement over community, control over connection, and power over patriotism. But in doing so, she had also revealed the fundamental weakness in her entire system of neighborhood domination. Karen's authority depended on keeping people isolated, afraid, and convinced that resistance was impossible. The 4th of July block party had proven that none of those conditions were actually true. People weren't isolated. They were united by shared frustration with Karen's tyranny. They weren't afraid. They were angry and ready to act. And resistance wasn't impossible. It just required coordination, strategy, and someone willing to take the first step. Standing in my driveway, looking at the evidence of community that had emerged despite Karen's best efforts to suppress it, I realized that the war for the neighborhood's soul was already being won. Karen just didn't know it yet. The day Karen blocked my driveway again, I didn't yell. I didn't complain. I just smiled, because this time it was exactly what I wanted her to do. 3 weeks had passed since the 4th of July block party, and the neighborhood's quiet resistance had been growing stronger. What had started as whispered conversations and knowing looks had evolved into something more substantial. Organized documentation of Karen's harassment, coordinated response to her enforcement campaigns, and most importantly, a shared commitment to ending her reign of terror through legal means rather than direct confrontation. The plan we had developed was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of fighting Karen's individual citations and fines, a process that played into her strength as someone who thrived on bureaucratic warfare, we would allow her to continue escalating her harassment until she crossed legal lines that would expose her to serious consequences. Karen's personality made her the architect of her own downfall. She couldn't resist pushing boundaries, testing limits, and escalating conflicts whenever she encountered resistance. All we had to do was give her enough rope to hang herself with, then document everything with the same obsessive thoroughness she had brought to terrorizing her neighbors. The trap was set on a Tuesday morning in late July. I had been strategically non-compliant with several of Karen's more absurd regulations. Nothing major enough to justify serious penalties, but visible enough to trigger her enforcement instincts. My garden hose was positioned 6 inches outside the approved storage area she had designated. My recycling bin was the wrong shade of blue according to her aesthetic guidelines. My truck was parked at a slight angle in my driveway instead of perfectly parallel to the house. Each violation was carefully calculated to be technically arguable, the kind of borderline infraction that would require Karen to either ignore it which her personality wouldn't allow, or enforce it so aggressively that she'd reveal the arbitrary nature of her authority. She chose escalation, exactly as we had anticipated. The first sign that our strategy was working came in the form of increasingly frequent phone calls. Karen's evening harassment calls went from twice a week to daily, then to multiple times per day. Her messages became longer, more detailed, and more obviously designed to intimidate rather than inform. "David, this is Karen calling about your continued non-compliance with community standards. I've documented 17 separate violations over the past week, and I'm beginning to think you're deliberately disregarding neighborhood regulations. I want you to understand that this behavior is creating problems for everyone, and if you continue to show such disrespect for our community, I'll have no choice but to pursue more serious enforcement measures." But the breakthrough came when Karen decided to make our conflict personal in a way that crossed legal boundaries. I was leaving for work on a Thursday morning when I found her red Escalade positioned across my driveway in exactly the same configuration as her initial harassment months earlier. But this time, instead of standing beside her vehicle to gloat about her power, Karen was nowhere to be seen. The message was clear. She was willing to make me late for work, cost me money, and interfere with my livelihood to assert her dominance. But she was also doing it in a way that eliminated her ability to claim it was accidental or coincidental. This was deliberate, calculated harassment designed to cause economic harm. I pulled out my phone and called Mrs. Patterson, who was positioned at her window as part of our coordination plan. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson. Karen's blocking my driveway again. Are you able to see what's happening from your window?" "I can see everything, David, and I'm already recording." The next call went to Mr. Rodriguez, who confirmed that he was also documenting the situation from his position near the corner. Then Janet, who had a clear view from her kitchen window. Then Mr. Walsh, who was strategically positioned in his garage. Within 5 minutes, we had 4 different neighbors independently documenting Karen's harassment from multiple angles, creating a record that would be impossible for her to dispute or explain away. But the most important call went to someone Karen didn't know about. Officer Sarah Chen, no relation to the family that had moved away, a community liaison with the local police department who had been quietly advising us about the legal aspects of HOA enforcement and neighbor harassment. "Officer Chen? This is David Martinez. We discussed the situation in my neighborhood last week. The incident we talked about is happening right now. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't engage with her directly, just document everything and let us handle it from here." The beauty of our plan was that we didn't have to accuse Karen of anything or make demands she could dismiss. We simply had to let her behavior speak for itself in front of official witnesses. Officer Chen arrived in an unmarked police car, parking across the street, where she could observe the situation without immediately revealing her authority. What she saw was exactly what we had described: a clear case of harassment designed to interfere with a resident's ability to use his own property. But Karen's reaction to the police presence was even better than we had hoped. Instead of recognizing that she had crossed a line and attempting to defuse the situation, Karen emerged from her house and approached Officer Chen with the aggressive confidence of someone who believed her HOA position granted her some kind of legal authority. "Excuse me, but this is a private neighborhood matter. HOA business doesn't require police interference unless someone has committed an actual crime." Officer Chen identified herself and explained that she was investigating a complaint about vehicle positioning that was interfering with property access. Karen's response was everything we had hoped for and more. "That man," she said, pointing at me, "has been violating community standards for months. I've documented dozens of infractions, filed appropriate citations, and followed every procedure outlined in our neighborhood bylaws. If he's having problems with enforcement, he can appeal through proper channels instead of wasting police resources on frivolous complaints. Ma'am, I understand there's an HOA dispute, but blocking someone's driveway is a separate issue that falls under municipal ordinances rather than private community rules. Karen's face flushed red with anger. This is my neighborhood. I've worked for years to maintain standards that protect everyone's property values. I'm not going to let some troublemaker destroy everything we've built here just because he doesn't want to follow simple rules. It was a beautiful moment. Karen had just claimed ownership of a neighborhood that didn't belong to her, asserted authority she didn't legally possess, and demonstrated the personal animosity that motivated her enforcement campaign, all in front of a police officer who was recording the conversation. But she wasn't finished. Officer, I don't think you understand the situation here. This man has been deliberately violating HOA regulations for months. He parks commercial vehicles in residential areas. He maintains his property below community standards. He's been uncooperative with board directives, and he's now trying to use police harassment to avoid accountability for his behavior. Every accusation Karen made was either false or irrelevant to the immediate situation. But more importantly, every word demonstrated that her actions were motivated by personal hostility rather than neutral enforcement of legitimate regulations. Officer Chen let Karen finish her rant, then asked a simple question. Ma'am, do you have legal authority to prevent residents from accessing their own driveways? I have authority to enforce community standards. That's not what I asked. Do you have legal authority to block someone's driveway? Karen's pause was telling. For the first time in months, she had encountered someone who wasn't intimidated by her position or impressed by her documentation. I'm parked on a public street, she said finally. Yes, ma'am, but you're positioned in a way that prevents this resident from accessing his property. That's different from normal street parking. What happened next was even better than we had planned. Instead of moving her car and ending the confrontation, Karen doubled down with the stubborn refusal to compromise that had characterized her entire approach to neighborhood management. I'm not moving my vehicle. If he has a problem with where I choose to park on public property, he can file a complaint through proper channels. Officer Chen looked at me, then at Karen, then at the red Escalade positioned obviously and deliberately across my driveway entrance. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to move your vehicle. This positioning constitutes interference with property access, regardless of HOA disputes. I refuse. This is harassment designed to help someone avoid legitimate community enforcement, and that was the moment Karen sealed her own fate. By refusing a direct police order to move her vehicle, she had escalated a civil matter into a criminal one. By claiming her HOA position gave her authority to ignore municipal regulations, she had demonstrated exactly the kind of abuse of power that we had been documenting for months. But most importantly, by losing control of her temper in front of an official witness, she had revealed the personal animosity and hunger for control that motivated everything she did. Officer Chen called for a tow truck. The next 20 minutes were the most satisfying of my entire conflict with Karen. As she stood in the street, shouting about property rights and community standards and police harassment, her precious red Escalade was hooked to a tow truck and dragged away from my driveway. But the real victory wasn't the immediate resolution of that morning's harassment. The real victory was the official police report that documented Karen's behavior, the citations she received for improper vehicle positioning and failure to comply with lawful orders, and, most importantly, the legal precedent that established her HOA authority did not supersede municipal regulations or give her license to interfere with her neighbor's property rights. As the tow truck disappeared around the corner, Karen turned to me with an expression of pure hatred. "This isn't over," she said. I smiled and nodded toward Mrs. Patterson's window, where our neighbor was still recording everything. "You're absolutely right, Karen. This is just the beginning." Karen thought she was untouchable, until the HOA board turned against her. The emergency HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday evening, ostensibly to address ongoing community disruptions that were threatening neighborhood, harmony, and property values. Karen's language, of course, designed to frame my resistance to her harassment as a threat to the community rather than a response to her abuse of authority. But Karen had made a crucial miscalculation. In her eagerness to paint me as a disruptive influence, she had inadvertently created exactly the kind of public forum that we had been hoping for, a chance to present our documented evidence of her systematic harassment to the entire neighborhood at once. The meeting was held in the community center at the entrance to our subdivision, a small building that usually hosted children's birthday parties and homeowner association administrative functions. By 7 p.m. it was packed with more residents than had attended any neighborhood event in years. Karen had expected to face me alone, probably with a handful of supporters who shared her vision of strict community control. Instead, she found herself looking at nearly 60 households, almost everyone in the neighborhood, many of whom were carrying their own folders of documentation. The atmosphere was electric, with the kind of tension that builds when people who have been silenced for months finally have an opportunity to speak. Karen called the meeting to order with her usual authoritative manner, but I could see uncertainty flickering behind her eyes as she surveyed the crowd. This wasn't the small, manageable group of compliant residents she was accustomed to addressing. "Thank you all for attending tonight's emergency session," she began, her voice carrying the formal tone she used for official HOA business. "We're here to address serious concerns about community standards, compliance, and the disruptive behavior that's been threatening our neighborhood's character." She launched into a prepared presentation that outlined my supposed violations over the past several months, complete with photographs, timestamps, and legal justifications for each citation she had issued. It was an impressive display of documentation that might have been persuasive if the audience hadn't been prepared for it. But as Karen spoke, something interesting began happening in the room. Instead of the respectful silence that usually greeted her presentations, neighbors were exchanging looks, nodding at each other, and quietly opening their own folders of evidence. When Karen finished her presentation and asked if there were any questions, Mr. Walsh raised his hand. "Karen, I appreciate the detailed documentation, but I'm curious about something. You've issued 37 citations to David over the past 6 months. How many citations have you issued to other residents during the same period?" It was a brilliant question that Karen clearly hadn't expected. She shuffled through her papers for a moment before responding. "I issue citations when violations occur. The number isn't as important as ensuring compliance with community standards." "That's not an answer to my question," Mr. Walsh replied calmly. "How many other residents have received citations?" Karen's pause was telling. "Several residents have received notices about various compliance issues." Mrs. Henderson stood up slowly, clutching her own folder of papers. "I've received 14 citations in the past 4 months, she said, her voice shaking but determined. 14 fines for things like having dandelions in my yard and positioning my trash bins incorrectly. I'm 78 years old and I've never had any problems maintaining my property until this year." A murmur rippled through the room as other residents began realizing they weren't alone in their experiences with Karen's enforcement campaign. Mrs. Morrison raised her hand. "My family has received 8 citations for things like our children's bicycles being visible from the street and playing in our own front yard during restricted hours. When did playing become a violation of community standards? More hands went up around the room. Janet spoke about harassment over her garden decorations. Mr. Rodriguez described citations for walking his dog at supposedly inappropriate times. The Chen family's neighbors shared stories about harassment they had witnessed. Before that family had been driven from the neighborhood entirely. But the most damaging testimony came from Officer Sarah Chen, who had been quietly sitting in the back of the room. I've been working with several residents over the past month to address concerns about HOA enforcement that may have crossed into legal harassment, she said when Karen reluctantly recognized her. Based on the documentation I've reviewed and the incident I witnessed last week, there appear to be serious questions about whether current enforcement practices comply with state laws regarding homeowner rights and anti-harassment statutes. Karen's CDO face went white. This is a private HOA meeting. Police don't have jurisdiction over community standards enforcement. You're correct that HOA boards have broad authority to create and enforce community regulations, Officer Chen replied calmly. But that authority has limits under state law. When enforcement becomes harassment, when citations appear to target specific residents, and when board members use their positions to interfere with residents' property rights, those actions can constitute criminal behavior regardless of HOA bylaws. The room fell silent as the implications of Officer Chen's statement sank in. Karen wasn't just abusing her HOA authority, she was potentially breaking actual laws. But the final blow came from an unexpected source. Tom Brennan, the former HOA president, who had resigned rather than continue fighting Karen's increasingly authoritarian policies. I need to share something with everyone, Tom said, standing up near the front of the room. When I was HOA president, Karen approached me multiple times about problem residents she wanted to force out of the neighborhood. She had specific targets, people she considered undesirable for various reasons, and she wanted to use selective enforcement to make their lives so difficult they would choose to sell their homes and leave. The room erupted in angry murmurs as residents realized that Karen's harassment wasn't random or motivated by community standards. It was a deliberate campaign to reshape the neighborhood according to her personal preferences. "That's absolutely false!" Karen shouted over the noise. "Tom resigned because he wasn't committed to maintaining property values. Everything I've done has been about protecting this community." Tom pulled out a small digital recorder and placed it on the table in front of him. "Karen, would you like me to play the recording of our conversation from March 15th, when you explicitly told me that you wanted to clean up the neighborhood by getting rid of undesirable elements who didn't fit your vision of appropriate residence?" The blood drained from Karen's face as she realized that her own words, recorded during what she had thought was a private conversation, were about to expose her true motivations to the entire neighborhood. You can't record private conversations. Without permission," she stammered. "Actually, under state law, I can record any conversation where I'm a participant, especially when it involves potential illegal activity," Tom replied, "and conspiracy to harass residents based on personal prejudice is illegal, regardless of HOA bylaws." The meeting dissolved into chaos as residents began shouting questions, demanding accountability, and expressing outrage at the scope of Karen's systematic abuse of power. But through the noise, one voice rose above the others. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had been quietly documenting Karen's activities for months. "I move for a vote of no confidence in Karen Phillips and her removal from all HOA positions," she declared in a voice that carried surprising strength. "All in favor?" Hands shot up throughout the room. Not just a few, but dozens of them, representing household after household that had suffered under Karen's regime. "All opposed?" Karen raised her own hand, along with perhaps 3 other residents who either hadn't experienced her harassment or still believed her claims about protecting property values. The vote wasn't even close. In less than 10 minutes, Karen had gone from neighborhood dictator to powerless resident facing potential criminal charges for harassment and abuse of authority. As the meeting broke up and residents filed out into the parking lot, sharing stories and contact information and relief at finally being free to speak openly about their experiences, Karen sat alone at the front table, surrounded by her folders of documentation and citations that no longer carried any authority. She had built her power on fear, intimidation, and the isolation of her targets. But when the community finally came together to compare experiences and share evidence, her entire system of control collapsed like the house of cards it had always been. Looking at her sitting there, staring at the remnants of her failed empire, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Karen had convinced herself that she was protecting the neighborhood, maintaining standards, and ensuring property values. But in reality, she had been destroying the very sense of community that made neighborhood living worthwhile. She had turned neighbors into enemies, homes into sources of stress, and community standards into weapons of personal control. The tragedy wasn't just that she had hurt so many people. It was that she had never understood the difference between leadership and domination, between community standards and personal prejudice, between protecting property values and destroying human dignity. As I walked to my car, I could hear Karen behind me, making one last desperate attempt to maintain her authority. "This isn't over," she called out to the parking lot full of neighbors who were no longer afraid of her. "I'll appeal this decision. I'll fight these accusations. You can't treat me like this." But her voice was drowned out by something much more powerful. The sound of neighbors talking to each other without fear, making plans for genuine community activities, and discussing how to rebuild the sense of trust and cooperation that Karen had systematically destroyed. The Queen had been dethroned, and for the first time in months, our neighborhood felt like a community again. For the first time in years, our neighborhood felt like a community again. The weeks following Karen's removal from the HOA board brought changes that went far beyond the simple absence of harassment citations and surveillance photography. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath for months and could finally exhale. Children appeared in front yards again, riding bicycles and playing games that had been deemed noise violations under Karen's regime. Mrs. Henderson planted a new flower garden with varieties that had been prohibited under the previous aesthetic standards. The Morrison family hung a tire swing from their oak tree without worrying about citations for unauthorized recreational equipment. Most remarkably, neighbors began talking to each other. The transformation started with simple interactions, conversations, over property lines that had been sources of tension, offers to help with yard work from people who had been afraid to be seen loitering in public areas, invitations to backyard barbecues that hadn't happened for years because of restrictions, on community gatherings. But it went deeper than social activities. People who had been living in fear of their own homeowners association began working together to rebuild trust, establish reasonable community standards, and create the kind of neighborhood environment that had originally attracted them to Maple Heights. The new HOA board, elected in an emergency vote 2 weeks after Karen's removal, consisted of residents who had lived through her harassment campaign and were committed to ensuring it never happened again. Their first act was to review and eliminate the dozens of arbitrary regulations that Karen had implemented during her reign. Gone were the restrictions on garden decorations, the precise positioning requirements for trash bins, and the subjective aesthetic standards that had been used to justify harassment. In their place came common-sense guidelines focused on genuine community concerns, basic property maintenance, noise considerations during sleeping hours, and safety issues that actually affected neighborhood well-being. The difference was immediately obvious. Instead of living in fear of violation citations, residents could focus on maintaining their properties because they cared about their homes and their neighbors, not because they were afraid of arbitrary punishment. But the most satisfying change was the restoration of dignity to community life. Under Karen's system, every interaction had been potentially adversarial. Neighbors couldn't trust each other because anyone might report violations. Children couldn't play freely because normal childhood activities had been criminalized. Adults couldn't pursue hobbies or interests that might attract scrutiny. Now, people could live like human beings again. Mrs. Henderson invited the neighborhood children to help with her new garden, teaching them about different flowers and vegetables, while they played in dirt that had once been the subject of citation threats. Mr. Rodriguez started an evening walking group that met at the community center and explored different routes through the subdivision. The Morrison family organized weekend soccer games in the common area that had been off-limits for unauthorized recreational activities. Even simple maintenance tasks became opportunities for community building. When Mr. Walsh's roof needed repairs, neighbors offered to help instead of worrying about citations for construction noise or equipment visibility. When Janet decided to repaint her house, she asked for color suggestions from neighbors rather than checking Karen's approved palette guidelines. The transformation extended beyond individual households to the character of the entire subdivision. Property values, which Karen had claimed to be protecting, actually increased as the neighborhood became a place where people wanted to live rather than a place they endured. New families moved into houses that had been on the market for months under the previous regime. Real estate agents began describing Maple Heights as a close-knit community rather than having to explain away HOA horror stories. But perhaps the most meaningful change was how the experience had affected everyone's understanding of community governance and civic responsibility. The HOA meetings under the new board were well-attended, productive discussion, where residents collaborated on genuine community issues rather than fearful gatherings where people hoped to avoid becoming enforcement targets. People who had never considered themselves activists became advocates for transparency, accountability, and fair treatment of all residents. The experience had taught everyone, myself included, important lessons about the difference between legitimate community standards and authoritarian control, between protecting property values and destroying human dignity, between leadership and domination. 3 months after Karen's removal, I was sitting on my front porch on a Saturday evening, drinking coffee and watching the neighborhood come alive in ways that would have been impossible under her regime. Children were playing street hockey with equipment that would have been cited for inappropriate storage. Adults were gathered, in small groups discussing a community garden project that would have violated multiple aesthetic regulations. Dogs were being walked at times and on routes that had once been prohibited. It was exactly the kind of neighborhood life that HOAs were supposed to facilitate rather than prevent. As I sat there, I thought about Karen and wondered what lessons she might have learned from her experience. The legal consequences of her harassment campaign had been relatively minor: fines, community service, and probation rather than serious criminal charges. But the social consequences had been complete. She had become a pariah in the very neighborhood she had tried to control, isolated by the same methods she had used to isolate others. In the end, Karen had gotten exactly what she deserved. She had been treated according to the same standards of judgment and exclusion that she had applied to her neighbors. The community had rejected her not through harassment or abuse, but through the simple democratic process of deciding they wanted leaders who served residents rather than ruling them. But more importantly, the entire experience had demonstrated something crucial about community life. Neighborhoods thrive when people feel safe, respected, and free to live according to their own values within reasonable bounds of mutual consideration. Karen had tried to create perfection through control, compliance through fear, and community through forced uniformity. The result had been the opposite of everything she claimed to want. Property values decreased, community spirit died, and neighbors became strangers who were afraid of each other. The restoration of genuine community standards based on mutual respect rather than authoritarian enforcement had created the kind of neighborhood that actually protected property values while allowing people to live with dignity and freedom. As the sun set over Maple Heights and families gathered for evening, activities without fear of citations or surveillance, I reflected on the broader lessons of our experience with HOA tyranny and community resistance. Bullies gain power by convincing their targets that resistance is futile, that compliance is easier than conflict, and that individual suffering is preferable to collective action. But when communities come together to document abuse, share experiences, and demand accountability, even the most entrenched tyrants can be removed through legal, democratic processes. The key was understanding that Karen's power had never been as absolute as she pretended. Her authority depended on fear, isolation, and the willingness of good people to remain silent rather than risk becoming targets themselves. When we stopped accepting those conditions and started working together, her entire system of control collapsed. Looking back, I realized that the most important victory hadn't been Karen's removal from the HOA board or even the end of her harassment campaign. The real victory was the restoration of something more fundamental, the understanding that communities belong to the people who live in them, not to self-appointed guardians who claim to know what's best for everyone else. In her attempt to create the perfect neighborhood through force and intimidation, Karen had nearly destroyed everything that made neighborhood living worthwhile. But in the process of resisting her tyranny, we had rediscovered what genuine community actually looked like. It looked like Mrs. Henderson teaching children about gardening without fear of citations. It looked like neighbors helping each other with home repairs without worrying about equipment violations. It looked like families celebrating holidays and birthdays without consulting enforcement guidelines. Most importantly, it looked like people who trusted each other, respected differences, and worked together to solve problems rather than living in constant fear of arbitrary punishment. As I finished my coffee and prepared to go inside, I caught sight of a red Escalade driving slowly through the neighborhood. Karen, apparently, conducting one final surveillance mission despite no longer having any authority to enforce whatever violations she might document. But instead of feeling anger or frustration at her continued presence, I felt something much more powerful: indifference. Karen could drive through our neighborhood as often as she wanted. She could take photographs and compile documentation and write reports that no one would ever read. She could fantasize about returning to power and reimposing her vision of perfect community control. None of it mattered anymore, because the community had learned the most important lesson of all. We didn't need Karen's permission to live our lives with dignity, freedom, and mutual respect. She had thought blocking my driveway would trap me in a system of harassment and control that would eventually drive me from the neighborhood entirely. Instead, it had been the catalyst for a community uprising that had freed everyone from her reign of terror. In the end, Karen's car hadn't just been towed away from my driveway that morning in July, her entire system of neighborhood domination had been permanently removed from our lives. And for the first time since she had moved to Maple Heights, our community could focus on what really mattered: being good neighbors to each other, maintaining our properties because we cared about our homes, and building the kind of place where families could thrive without fear. The Queen was gone. The ideal neighborhood was ours again, and that was exactly how it should be.